social science and natural science research, and they were giving a moratorium for social science research for 2 months to allow to be everything set up and really protect vulnerable populations before researchers come in, even with their best interests at heart. And we can all do more to communicate constructively about disasters, and this was led by the Aceh chapter of the Indonesian Association of Journalists, who invited international journalists to sign a pledge to report ethically and in support of healing and community development. Not many journalists sadly signed this pledge, and so I leave it here. And thank you for the time they've given me for this for going a little bit over. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Do take notes of your questions. What I'm going to do is that let's hear all the panelists first, and then I'll open the floor for questions as well. But you might forget your questions, so make sure that you write them in your package. There is a notebook and a pen. Our next presenter is John Packerman. She's Director of the Office of Human Research Compliance at the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. And here it says how long we have been going for. Oh, I'm sorry.
Good morning. I would like to sincerely thank the organizers for inviting the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences, National Institutes of Health to this important inaugural meeting as we come together to discuss important ways to transit engagement to approach disaster research, especially as we talk about lessons learned from Puerto Rico. I bring you greetings from National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. For those of you who don't know us, we are one of the 27 institutes of the National Institutes of Health. However, we're located in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina, away from the Bethesda, Maryland area. We've been there for over 50 years. And our mission is to discover how the environment affects people in order to promote healthier lives. And our vision is to provide global leadership for innovative research that improves public health by preventing disaster and disability. So NIEHS has played a major role in IRB reviews, response, and research efforts in many of the most recent disasters, including the 9/11 World Trade Center terrorist attack, Hurricane Katrina, the Gulf oil spill, Superstorm Sandy, Flint, Michigan water crisis, Ebola crisis in West Africa, California fires, and in our own North Carolina backyard, we've had 3 major hurricanes that have wiped us out. Hurricane Matthew in 2016, Hurricane Florence in 2018, and Hurricane Dorian this summer in 2019. So as the list of public health emergencies and disasters continually grows, it challenges our national resiliency. Therefore, government agencies are increasing their efforts to strengthen our nation's preparedness, response, and recovery, including the need for high quality and timely disaster research. Time-critical research is needed, and despite its importance, long-standing challenges have been often encountered, resulting in delayed and missed opportunities to perform critical research, such as no formal way to activate and coordinate research, difficulty funding research, slow reviews of protocols, IRB issues, ethical issues not addressed, lack of ready-to-go research tools and protocols, lack of trained researchers to gather data, lack of inclusion of community stakeholders, and exposure data missing or not helpful. To better respond to these challenges, in the fall of 2013, the NIH director, Dr. Francis Collins, initiated the DR2 Initiative, and the NIEHS in collaboration with the National Library of Medicine, took the lead and started the NIH Disaster Research Response Program. Our goal is to improve our national and global capacity to perform timely human health research in response to disasters and other emerging threats through targeted efforts, including rapidly identifying data gaps in disaster science, faster and more efficient processes for IRB reviews, decision-making and funding approaches, access to disaster-related data collection tools, training researchers and IRBs, establishing collaboration in global networks and partners to develop DR2-related programming. We just signed 2 memorandums of understanding with DR2 Canada and DR2 Japan to further support the development of needed infrastructure to create an international community of researchers that can provide critical assistance, engaging all stakeholders, effectively integrating with the federal and state emergency management systems. So I often like to start these talks by this quote from David Abramson, which says, "Disaster is often defined by chaos and by the disruption or destruction of local social systems and organizations. Yet, both research and human subjects protection are often defined by an imposed framework of order based on social observation and interaction." With this said, then, the questions become, how do we marry the two, research and human subjects protection? How do we marry them adequately to protect survivors of disasters who serve as research participants in disaster and emergency-related research? And how do we adequately protect and respect the community in which they live and work, while at the same time allowing researchers to have the unique opportunity to collect valuable data that may be lost if too much time passes? This is a very sensitive, intricate issue. How do we successfully do this so that it is a win-win situation for the researcher, the study participant, and the community? With the growing need to understand human exposures and health consequences of those exposures after disasters, IRBs are now being asked to review protocols that seek to obtain health information, the collection of clinical measurements and biological specimens to assess health risks from disaster survivors and responders, beginning in the immediate aftermath of a disaster. So, how many of you know about the IRB? All right. IRBs can play a key role as the gatekeepers, right, to the disaster research enterprise. It is our responsibility to protect impacted populations from research-related harms. And the NIEHS IRB has reviewed disaster-related protocols over the years and has found challenges in the review of these protocols. We found research conducted during disasters, especially in the immediate aftermath, is not business as usual. Special considerations are needed when reviewing disaster research protocols. There is very little guidance on the practices for IRB reviewing disaster protocols. There is great concern regarding interference in disaster response and provision of disaster aid. Understanding the need for situational awareness to provide disaster context and an understanding of the impacted community and its culture is important. Assessing participant community vulnerability, participant burden in the immediate aftermath of a disaster is critical. Lastly, ensuring the safety and training the research team has to be considered. So in 2014, the NIEHS developed and convened a working group to initiate dialogue on special considerations and best practices for IRB review of disaster research. The purpose of the working group was to discuss human research protection issues in the context of disaster research, to identify recommendations to guide IRBs in their review of disaster-related protocol. The outcome, the development of best practices for IRBs who review disaster-related research. These best practices will increase protections and protect the welfare of the disaster research participant and the community. The working group meeting was a 2.5-day meeting. The working group consisted of 70 members from 23 U.S. states, representing multiple disciplines, including academic researchers, bioethicists, disaster responders, local, state, and federal officials, disaster survivors, community advocates, and IRB leaders and regulatory officials. And due to the multidisciplinary expertise of the working group, it took us a year to prepare them to come to the meeting. So we took a year of preparation, so when they came through our door, they were ready for business. And so we hosted several webinars to get them ready and several presentations, and we had a SharePoint site with important educational material. The working group produced 15 recommendations as best practices for IRB disaster research. And these are the 5 overarching themes of the 15 recommendations. IRB preparedness, participant vulnerability, contextual understanding of disaster-specific factors, IRB responsibilities and review processes, timely dissemination of research results. Okay, back to the key stakeholders and participants. And if you want to look at the other recommendations, the 15 work of recommendations, I point you to our brief communication that was in the Environmental Perspectives Journal in 2017. So what we have been doing for the past few years is establishing a national DR2 Institutional Review Board preparedness program. Based on the work group recommendations, we have established this national program. The overarching goal of the program is to engage with IRBs, investigators, universities, communities, federal agencies, disaster managers, and survivors by providing preparedness tools, resources, and training to protect human subjects impacted by disasters from research-related harms. We have developed the critical review factors model that helps IRBs to think about all the factors that should be considered in reviewing disaster studies as it relates to disaster-impacted populations and for human protections. There are 5 critical factors that contribute to disaster-related vulnerability that are necessary for IRBs to consider. These include disaster type, magnitude, and aftermath. Does the protocol adequately describe and address the context of the disaster, pre and post-disaster? Risk and benefit. What are the risks and benefits of the proposed research? Does it take in consideration participant burden? I'm trying to go really fast. Type of researcher readiness, frequency of IRB review, time point in the disaster management cycle. Do the study procedures consider the stage and magnitude of the disaster and the potential impact of the study on the study population? This involves study initiation and timing. Potential subject. Does research recruitment consider potential subject needs, equitable subject selection, and protection of vulnerable population? This includes potential subject status, subject health status, relationship and stability, cultural considerations, privacy, oops, I'm going fast, y'all, I got just a couple more slides, confidentiality, and disaster-specific consent process. And number 5, return of results. Does the research protocol include plans to inform all stakeholders, participant, local community, city, responder community, about the study progress, results within a timely manner, and this is especially needed for exposure-related protocols. We have developed 2 tools to assist disaster research protocol review processes in addressing human research protection issues, one for investigators or researchers and one for IRBs. The post-disaster research engagement in the community profile template is a tool for PIs to add the pre and post-disaster contextual information. This template, which has fields for data collection on the area prior to the disaster and after disaster, is added to the protocol, and it gives the IRB an opportunity to determine if the PIs have considered the community and the impact pre and post disaster on the community. It is assumed that researchers that understand an affected community prior to an event are more likely to be successful. Pre-disaster context may be particularly important for researchers coming in from the outside, as you well may know, who may not have a full understanding of the demographic and cultural landscape of the community they are working in. The NIEHS Disaster Research Review Checklist is intended to be completed by an IRB as it reviews the disaster research protocol. It is intended to supplement, not to substitute, for any existing standard IRB review criteria. While some of the questions in the checklist are similar to what you might find in the standard IRB review process, there are many others which reflect the unique disaster-related setting in which the research intends to occur. Disasters are not business as usual, and IRB should not review disaster research protocols as business as usual. The checklist is organized by the 5 critical review factors, and under each question there are points to consider to help the reviewer think through their response to the question. Now, if you see this one called RAPID, RAPID is a protocol that was pre-approved by, it's a disaster protocol that is called the Rapid, Acquisition of Pre- and Post-Incident Data Study. And it allows the researcher and the IRB to work ahead of disasters to develop a plug-and-play protocol. It is an umbrella protocol that is pre-approved generic protocol. The protocol, once in place, would serve as a pre-approved umbrella protocol that would allow researchers to submit amendments to the IRB for approval prior to the immediate wake of a disaster. This allows researchers the opportunity to enter into the disaster field within hours to days. But as I said, this is a pre-vetted protocol. It has been adopted by the University of Iowa, the University of Texas Medical Branch, and the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Okay. So in 2014, we took on this national training curriculum of training tribal nations. We went to the University of Texas Medical Branch to do a site visit of their rapid protocol a day before Hurricane Harvey hit. And so we talked with city officials, we talked with communities. These people have been hit also by multiple hurricanes, Ike, Rita, and so Hurricane Harvey was their third one. And so I gotta hurry up and finish. But we are working with various federal partners, the CDC, University of Arizona, tribal nations. And my last slide. We provide disaster expertise, curriculum-based training, and regulatory guidance. My last question to you is your IRB prepared? Thank you.
Thanks so much. All of us have so much to say, and it is so hard to, because we're very passionate about what we're doing, and it's very hard to keep on track. But thanks so much. I have so many things to say. Our next panelist is Lori Peak. She's director of the Natural Hazards Center and professor of the Department of Sociology at the University of Colorado, Boulder. Here you can keep track of your time.
Okay, thank you. Hi, good morning, everyone. I first and foremost want to thank Marla and Cecilio for drawing this panel together. We had a pre-organizing call, and it was one of my most inspiring calls of the semester. We went over in the call, too, because we have much to say. And I want to thank all of you for being in here today. As you can see, I've slightly modified our session title. In the book, it's called The Ethical Challenges of Disaster Research. But I think what is so exciting about us being here at the University of Albany is these challenges are actually real opportunities for us to assert leadership. If not the hazards and disaster field leading the way with research ethics, then who? What other field confronts ethical challenges more than us? Just like medical doctors have the Hippocratic Oath, what is our Hippocratic Oath, and how are we going to develop this together? This is, I think, the message of this conference, and this is the opportunity for us as researchers and practitioners. And so when Marla tells me to do something, I take it very literally. She sent us an email asking us to respond to 4 questions, and you have heard the answers to these questions from our beautiful and esteemed panelists who have preceded me. And so I'm going to start where Marla started. So number 1, what has been your experience doing disaster research? I am here to report that I actually, became a disaster researcher 20 years ago. In 1999, I joined the Natural Hazard Center as a graduate research assistant at the University of Colorado Boulder. My first major experience in doing disaster research was after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And in the many years since, my research has taken me to communities struck low by disaster. And I think what has characterized my research has really been 2 things. One, oftentimes those quick response investigations have then grown into longitudinal explorations. Second big thing is almost all of my research has focused on populations that are marginalized during non-disaster times, and then trying to understand how that unfolds in disaster. The other big thing that has marked my experience in doing disaster research is the recognition of how fast and furious these events are coming. In 1999, there was some kind of sense that we could catch our breath. Today, before one is even done and the emergency responders are out of the field, the next one is unfolding. See Harvey, Irma, and Maria as evidence 1. Second, what are the main ethical concerns regarding doing research with disaster survivors? This is where Marla will note that I have slightly modified her question because she asked us to respond to what is the main ethical concern, singular. I modified it to the plural because there was no way I could answer this with 1. So in responding to the questions that Marla has posed to us, I want to say that I'm actually going to draw on 3 pieces that I have had the opportunity to co-author with colleagues and friends over the years, but much of this scholarship that I'm going to refer to has been deeply informed by people who are sitting in this room. And so the first one I want to refer to is actually coming out this week in Nature. JC Gaillard and I have written a comment piece calling for a code of conduct for the hazards and disaster research field. And so in response to Marla's question about what is the primary ethical concern, I think the number 1 thing is that ethical concerns should have the same primacy as research questions, that they should be on the same level. Think about what we say to graduate students. What's your question? The question should guide everything you do. What if the first thing we said to our students was, what is your ethical practice? And how does that guide everything that you do? Case in point. In 2004, the Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami killed hundreds of thousands of people across a multinational region. After that earthquake and tsunami, hundreds of researchers descended on the region, and the research that was produced has saved lives. At the 10-year anniversary of that event, there were several major publications that took stock of that research. We know that we have improved warning systems, response protocols that are saving lives because they have been tested in subsequent earthquakes and tsunamis. At the same time, after that event, the former governor of Aceh, Indonesia, where 128,000 people died in that earthquake and tsunami, described foreign researchers as guerrillas applying hit-and-run tactics. The Indonesian government has taken dramatic steps in response to this. Over the past couple of years, they have passed legislation that if you do not have a local research partner, if your research has not been approved by the Indonesian government, you can be fined and you can actually be imprisoned. In 2018, the Sulawesi tsunami affected Indonesia again, and researchers found themselves stuck at the border who were not aware of these new strict protocols that had been enacted by the government, and so they found themselves unable to enter because they did not have a local Indonesian partner. And so we argue in this piece that the field needs, and this is important, a researcher-driven code of conduct, not a top-down, not a national or even university-led. A researcher-driven code of conduct that will do three things. Establish a clear purpose for disaster research. If we are going to go into the field to collect perishable data, why are we going and what are we going to learn? That will respect local survivors and scholars, but also protect the rights of researchers. Jim Kendra and Sarah Gregory have recently written a very provocative and compelling piece where they argue for that researchers have rights as well. And then on the other side of the coin, we also know that local survivors and scholars oftentimes may get affected in these events. So I believe coming together like this, we can do both and. We can do both and. And then third, I think we need to identify and coordinate researchers to reduce duplication of effort and to minimize what I'm going to refer to as the researcher footprint. Second piece I want to draw on here is actually the methodological appendix that Alice Fothergill, fellow sociologist and friend, and I wrote as part of Children of Katrina. So one of the things that we walked away with after doing nearly a decade of research with children after that event was that there is simply no one-size-fits-all approach for ethics in practice. And so any researcher code of conduct that we co-develop as a community should carefully consider some of the following aspects, including how our ethical responsibilities intersect with things like participant and researcher diversity and embodied identities along age, racial, ethnic, citizenship, class, gender, sexual orientation, ability, and other lines. Every single day when Alice and I did this research, we were different on all of these dimensions from the children that we were studying. But I believe that when we center ethics, that research across these lines can be possible, but only when we center our ethics first. We also need to, why there's no one size fits all is because no community, no country has the same history. And so when we go to do research, we need to think carefully about contexts that have been deeply marked by histories of colonialism, structural violence, and racism. And also thinking about how does our research engage with ongoing embedded histories of social injustice, and what is our goal if not for social justice? Third question that Marla posed to us: what changes, if any, should universities implement in our disaster research protocols? And this one I have slyly also modified to say what changes, if any, should researchers implement in our disaster research protocols? Because we know, while IRB is prime in the North American context, many universities around the world do not have institutional review boards. And so what about when we're going into countries and contexts that don't have national or educational level guidance? The anthropologist Kate Brown and I wrote a paper called Beyond the IRB, an ethical toolkit for long-term disaster research, where one of our core arguments is that we need to expand our frame of thinking about research ethics and disasters to think about an ethical frame that moves beyond that narrow slice in time of writing our institutional review board protocol to think about the long term, as Joan so eloquently just described to us. We also argue that we have to move on beyond the utilitarian ethics or Kantian ethics that are that define much of our modern university systems, to use a more robust ethical framework that really takes broader ethical principles into account. And we use the work of W.D. Ross to inform that. And so we argue that we could train researchers to develop their own ethical toolkits where they would understand what all these ethical principles mean, and then when we're confronted with ethical landmines in the field, we would be more ready to think in a more complex and ethical way about how to respond. So researchers, we can work together to do this, and what do we need to do? So we can identify our guiding ethical principles, which again, this conference is launching us forward in that space. We can set clear research priorities. We can establish coordinating protocols, which I'm going to talk about in a moment very briefly, and develop a culture of sharing our data and publishing our data, which I'm also going to talk about. So what would need to change if we were going to do those things? This is the fourth and final question that Marla posed to us, because we can all have ideas, but we know if we do not have enabling conditions through our organizations, those ideas oftentimes do not come to fruition. So I'm going to share with you briefly some of the work that we are doing through a new facility at the University of Colorado Boulder that is called Converge. And the National Science Foundation over the past 5 years has invested over $60 million in the natural hazards engineering research infrastructure in our nation. That's the physical infrastructure that allows us to do testing and other engineering work in particular. However, there is a recognition if we don't have the social infrastructure, what we heard from Cecilio this morning, if we don't have the relationships and the capability to come together, then how do we ever get that engineering work into action? And Converge is about doing some of the following things. So first, one of the things that we are trying to do is to identify, engage, and coordinate researchers before disaster strikes, during a disaster, and after a disaster. In the Paradise wildfires, which another catastrophic event that claimed lives, right now in Paradise, which is a small municipality, we have learned that they have stopped responding to emails, phone calls from researchers because they are such a small community with such a small governing structure. They cannot respond anymore, so they have started deleting messages from researchers. And so one of the things we're trying to work on is how do we get research communities organized in advance and working together. And so the National Science Foundation has invested in funding and supporting a series of research coordinating networks for geotechnical engineering, structural engineering, the social and behavioral sciences, nearshore systems, operations and systems engineering, and for interdisciplinary sciences, so we can get organized in advance. 3 days ago, the leaders of all these networks, we were in Washington, D.C. together, and we started running a tabletop exercise so we could talk about how we can get organized together. Again, so the people in Paradise, they aren't getting 100 calls from lots of different researchers, so we can be working together before, but that takes the relationships that Cecilio referred to. Second big thing we're trying to do is to identify locally effective researchers in disaster and to prioritize existing and ongoing research as well as emergent needs that come about in the disaster. And so the Social Science Extreme Events Research Network is one of the 2 extreme events research networks that I am the principal investigator for. Over the past year, we have had over 800 social and behavioral scientists around the world who have signed up for this network, and they are on, as well as their expertise is on this interactive map where you can find the researchers. And so when